All right, well, we'll get started. Um, Sorry, first of all, for the confusion on the Slack channel invites. Uh, that was my mistake. Um, yeah, basically, we have two Slacks and we invited you to the wrong Slack. Also want to introduce Dante, who's on the call. So Dante's my son. He's kind of learning the business. He's going to help with some of the facilitation of these calls. Dante, say hi.
Hi guys, nice to meet you. Sorry about that Slack channel thing.
Hey, all good.
Yeah,
Uh,
so on this call, I wanted to kind of cover people and culture, probably in sort of three different areas. So the first being, how do you look at it from a diligence perspective? Because it's something that seems highly qualitative, yet it's also probably the thing that I think affects the intrinsic value of a company more than any other single variable. We'll also spend a bit of time talking about sort of the integration process and like the setup of a leadership team and sort of what that first on-site visit looks like and how training should work within the company. And then we can talk a bit about hiring and sort of employee value propositions, stuff like that. Just like all calls at any time, feel free to either leave a question in the chat um, and interrupt, and I'll address it right away. Sound good? All right. So in terms of diligence, um, as I mentioned, company culture is probably the single most important variable. For those that aren't aware, there is a course in Thinkific called Calculating the Intrinsic Value of a Company's Second Pass. And within that, there's a part on company culture, and it kind of gives some guidance on sort of what I look at typically and how I might sort of adjust the starting multiple of a business. And it's probably, I think it's the largest of all the variables, in that you can go up 20% from the starting multiple or down 20% from the starting multiple, depending on various criteria. Um, I've had companies with bad culture and I've had companies with good culture. Um, and it makes a huge difference. Growth takes way longer uh, with poor culture. Hiring is very difficult in a company with poor culture. There is a word on the street locally within the community, and it can take months to kind of turn that around if a company has poor culture. Um, Change management is like way more stressful, way harder to get buy-in, and you're more likely to lose key people. And if you do, just those people are harder to replace. So for all those reasons, for me, bad culture, like objectively bad culture, is usually a red flag, just because I just don't have the energy to deal with that anymore. Um, but if not, then I'd say it at least, makes a deal worth less than an alternative. So some of the things that you'd want to look at to determine if a company has bad culture. Well, I'd say the number one thing, and this is very qualitative, is I would say in all conversations with the owner, you need to be looking at whether they are constantly looking at taking care of their people as their primary motivation, right? So look for evidence of that and evidence against that. Don't obviously objectively ask it, but try to keep that in the back of your mind at all times. Because the commonalities of these good businesses, of everything that we've bought, it has the same sort of seller or owner operator who basically wants to keep their people busy and take care of their customers. Um, that's how I would sort of qualify all of those owners. Um, so that's sort of number one. In terms of lagging indicators, which are useful for diligence, I'd say you want to understand tenure for the company. So specifically, you want to know what percentage of the company is sort of usually, I'd say, under 2 years employed, and what percent of the company is sort of over 5 years employed. And then you also want to know what percentage of key roles is sort of under 2 years and over 5 years. That's like the easiest thing. You want to know hiring metrics, which no one will track, so you'll have to ask individually. So who, like, basically you want to know, like, how long does that actually take to hire someone? Because that shows, not only does it show whether or not company has like a good reputation, but also shows strength in people and culture department. So I would always ask, who's the last person hired? What was the process like to hire them? Who managed that process? And then I'd split that up, like, who made the job offer, who screened, who interviewed, who onboarded, because often that's multiple people in the company, right? And that will also kind of give you an understanding of who the people and culture person in the company may be going forward, if you want to actually hire someone for that role, or basically promote someone from within for that role. And most importantly, how long did it take? Like, between identifying someone and hiring them, how long does that take? A strong company will be able to do that within 30 days. A lot of these may take 90 or 120. I would also want to know the date. So you'll usually ask people for, obviously a list of all their employees, date hired, how much they're paid. I'd want to know a date of last raise. And I want to know a date of their most recent bonus and what their bonus was, and the justification for the bonuses. And also always ask a date of future raise, or at least future appraisal, and date of future bonuses, and what that is. And at this point, when you're asking these questions directly, they can't sandbag you, right? They have to answer honestly if they promise someone a raise. That's also, from a finance perspective, it's very important to know. There have been some companies where, at the end of the due diligence process, right before signing the purchase agreement, we find that there's like $15,000 of bonuses that are being paid out in the next 3 months. And another really important note that I would say I learned by buying multiple businesses that I did not understand before going into it, was really understanding the value of the employee demographic, and sort of designing a value proposition specifically around the ideal employee in that region, which can be very different depending where you are. So as an example, like, a lot of companies will have a Latino workforce, which has very different needs than, let's say, a Gen Z, millennial, American-born workforce, right? So the latter, really values work-life balance, right? And giving back. And so for those of you who've gone to like High Five Plumbing, as one of the tours that we do at workshops in Denver, he really targets that particular demographic, and everything is sort of crafted around that. That the way he promotes would not work for a Latino workforce who wants to work as much as they possibly can, really values overtime at time and a half, because they want to remit 80% of their paycheck, right, and send it back home. So that's really important to understand and to kind of make a decision about very early, because a lot of the time the companies that you're looking at are really in between. They have a mix of everything. Another great question to ask is, when did X key person in the business take their last vacation? For how long? Did they still take calls, right? That's also a good question to ask if you get to the point where you're doing one-on-ones with key people, which will usually be like right before signing a purchase agreement. Just to understand sort of what the culture looks like. Something good to know is whether the owners make loans often to their employees. I mean, you'll see this pretty much all the time. But the reality is, if an owner is making a lot of loans, and that is actually part of the value prop for the employees that work there, right? And if you're not planning on doing that going forward, it's something to just be aware of. And again, most of these companies, I'd say the owners kind of like, the dad, and a lot of the employees kind of live hand to mouth a little bit, and will ask for advances. So something to also be aware of and have a policy on really early. And then lastly, benefit plans. I used to think that a company with a good benefits plan meant they had a good culture. I've seen too many examples of the inverse to still think that. And I've also seen examples of poor benefit plans having great cultures. That being said, I would say you should look at a burden of at least 30%, right? Including everything, health, stat holidays, employer pay premiums, retirement plan co-payments, vacation. If it's doing under 30%, I think you should probably budget. You're going to have to up it to 30%. So that's really more of a financial thing than a people and culture thing. But I think if you don't, I mean, everyone's aware if they have bad sort of benefits. But I think if you don't plan to do that, the change management is going to be a little bit harder, right? So, I mean, that's mainly, those are my notes on the diligence side of company culture. Anyone have any questions?
You said 30% for benefits. 30% of what?
Of their base. Yeah.
So I had a question. When you mentioned, date of their last raise, so as far as I've gathered, part of the change is like is it normal to give everybody a raise? Like, you're like, oh, I'm the new guy, blah, blah, blah. And if so, do you so if they haven't had a raise, or maybe they don't have regular annual reviews or raises, like, are you factoring that into, your earnings and maybe retrading the deal, or do you find that that's normally a problem, or do you kind of take it on the chin and you're like, okay, this is just what we have to do?
Yeah, I mean, I typically wouldn't renegotiate a deal over, one or two small changes. If there's a lot of things all at once, if you're getting into, meaningful 5 figures a year, then I would. And usually that's not about one person getting a raise so much as like maybe a bunch of bonuses being missed, or maybe like a few key people getting pretty meaningful raises. And then I'd factor that against maybe some of the positive outcomes of diligence, right? To see whether I actually want to look at this, because sometimes you have a negative balance here, but a positive balance elsewhere.
And then, so to maybe piggyback on that, so you mentioned like bonuses pending, right? So let's say, they do a bonus at the end of every year, and let's say it's all across all the employees, it's like $100,000, and you close in June. Are you expecting the seller to pay half of that, right? Like, is he on the hook for half of that, and then you would kind of be on the hook for the other half, obviously? And you would just make that clear, I guess, or would you have him bonus them out at close, maybe half early or something, or how does it?
Typically, I'd hope I'd see this earlier in the process, such that it would affect the purchase price, right?
Yeah.
Because that's part of SDE. Now, if I found it later in the process, and it was, more difficult to say I'm going to bring the, purchase price down, that's what I would do. I'd say, yeah, okay, well, can you pay, up to the 6 months bonus at close to your employees, and I'll pay the rest, in December.
Okay. Yeah, fair. I have a feeling I'm gonna have to deal with that.
Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes you run into situations like I was doing a deal that they were paying bonuses annually, and then they would switch over to paying bonuses quarterly, and then we were buying the deal like in Q3. So you have to kind of adjust around that.
Do you so one item of, and I don't know if this was in one of the checklists, but it was like name and position of like any key employee that's like left in the last 2 years. I don't know if that was in the Acquira one, or if I found it somewhere else. It seemed interesting though, as far as like,
Yep.
kind of knowing if somebody maybe just left, right, and then what they did, etc.
Yeah, I asked that question usually on a site visit as well, and then I ask it again to the seller on usually the first week on site after close, because in many cases that's an opportunity to rehire a person with a lot of experience. In fact, in 2 different AEs got their GM from an ex-employee that quit because I guess didn't have a great relationship anymore with the seller, but had been trained to basically be a GM in the past. And they both worked out quite well a few years in.
Gotcha. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't even think about it from that angle, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, so that does make
Yeah.
sense. I don't know if anybody else has another question, but I have one more question, and that was, and I'll just pop before out. He just raised his hand. The uh, the checklist, right? So we have the Acquira list, right? It's got like, I don't know, 100 questions, right, for diligence post LOI. So I've specifically held back on my list because I'm trying to get the seller to finish the QOV first, and he's like being slow, and I don't want to like distract him. So do you just kind of give them a huge, like, do you give them this checklist, or do you structure it in some other way to kind of get all of these items answered?
Usually I'll structure it in a, I like to look at this as kind of sunk cost fallacy. So if we're talking pre-LOI, I'm very careful with asking questions slowly and only the most important questions, because the more time they put into the process, the more time they're willing to continue to put into the process, right? If I come into it and say, here's 45 pre-LOI questions, answer them, that's not going to go well. Every once in a while, you find the personality of a seller is like a pit bull who just wants to finish it, right? And they appreciate just having a checklist of everything you need, and they'll get to it. Actually, it's more frequent than every once in a while. It's probably like 1/3 of the time. So yeah, pre-LOI definitely spoon feed. Post LOI, I would say you can, at this point they've signed LOI, there's exclusivity in place. I'd say you can be a little bit more aggressive. You could probably ask questions, 15 to 20 at a time, at the very least. And if the personality of the seller allows it, yeah, just go ahead and share the whole thing.
Cool. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Can I add a little to that?
For sure, please.
When just after LOI, or like with LOI, I went through that big list that Acquira supplied, and I identified about 40 of the most relevant questions. And then I sent a pretty good list of them, but I also went a little further and kind of categorized, like, is this a good question to send in a list? Is it like requesting a document back to me, or is it better handled in a conversation? So I tried to separate them out and say, I'm going to be meeting with the seller every week for the next month or two, and I'll have a lot of time to talk to him, and I need content to talk to him about. So a lot of them, and I found too, I sent him some stuff that I expected a document back, and he gave me almost nothing. So I had to go back and I had to ask a question and have a conversation to really get the answer. So I think it's good to kind of keep that in mind. You don't want to send him something that he can just, or he or she can just, no, there's your response. You want to take some time and like dig into it, and those are good for conversation.
Yeah, I'd also add that on the pre-LOI stage, because we do this a lot with off-market deals, is often you just want to know if something kind of exists, but you don't want to slow things down by asking them to prepare it, right? And so I'll try to get a few things on a call, just get verbal confirmation of it, as opposed to, like, most people don't have an org chart, right? And so instead of asking them to prepare an org chart for me, I'll just ask them, hey, who are the managers? How many managers in the company? How many people report to each person? Done. Then I can just jot it down live on the call. Same thing goes for, like, I don't need a list of, your top 10 customers by revenue. I really just need to know who's your top customer, and like approximately how much of your business do they represent, and then who's kind of number two, and that's it. That's all I really need to know. And if the number is like 40% or 50%, then I'll I'll ask for details. I think Alec, you raised your hand.
Yep. Hey, Hayden, how's it going?
Good.
Kind of piggybacking off of what James was talking about, when it comes to dividends and equity, especially if you're going into a stock sale type of situation, they are like the owner is willing, excuse me, to hand over 100% of that business in that acquisition. Do you see it advantageous to keep an equivalent dividend, replace that with some sort of cash bonus, maybe not buy 100% of that equity? I'm kind of juggling what I want that to look like for two circumstances, not even just one. So advice in that realm, or where you think that lands.
So to clarify, there are existing employees that own some equity in the company. You're doing a stock sale, seeing if you want to buy their equity or not.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. How much are we talking?
Less than 30%, less than a minority stake. Well, actually, right on that cusp, for right below the cusp for one of them, and then right above the cusp for being a little bit over 30% for the other. So roughly 30% for both.
And how key are they to the company going forward? Obviously, they're staying.
Yes. And then some, in one circumstance, not all of them are direct employees. Some are just stakeholders, period. Like early investors. So they would exit, right? So then on both situations, it'd be under 30%. But it's a lot of sales and then general management kind of that is in place roles. So yes, they are key players in that.
I mean, I think a big part of it is what they want. I would say anyone who's not actively involved, I would want to cash out. You don't want anyone on your cap table who's not actively involved. Anyone who is actively involved, I'd probably give them the choice, and I'd probably have the preference for them to. Well, it depends. I mean, I'd still want to incentivize them, even if it means.
Yeah.
Most people are not incentivized by stock and ownership in these companies. Are way more incentivized by cash. So if someone's like within a leadership position in the business, instead of typically giving equity early on because they're not that incentivized by it, we'll typically give them a percentage of EBITDA growth, right, across the leadership team. So if they're actively involved, if they want to be cashed out, I would consider cashing them out, but still having some other form of incentive.
Okay. So yeah.
If the cash out is massive, like if it's enough for them to go out and start their own business or not have to work for a few years, I might look at that a little differently.
Understood. Yeah. So some sort of performance-based cash bonus in replace of that direct equity tied dividend, if you will.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
You also you don't want to give mixed incentives too. So that you may be really incentivized to, invest in growth in the company, where someone else may really depend on a common dividend, and then they may be annoyed by your choice because you're just in different places, right?
Yep. Okay. No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, I believe that's Thomas next. I'm sorry if I butchered that.
Yeah, thank you. So back to the previous question that Alec had, I was also thinking about how I'm going to incentivize key team members to stay on board, and I was thinking of giving them some kind of equity incentive, but what I'm hearing from you, Hayden, now is that some kind of profit sharing or anything that is more related to cash and maybe easier for them to grasp or more tangible for them would produce better results. Is that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for these types of businesses, 100%. Because this is not Silicon Valley. It's not, we're going to become a unicorn or raise a Series B or. What we typically do is we'll issue a bonus to the leadership team. It's usually about 10% of EBITDA growth over a baseline. And either we do not change that baseline over time, meaning year one, year two, that bonus may not be meaningful or super meaningful, but if you have 20% growth year 1, year 2, year 3, and that baseline hasn't moved, now if somebody quits, they're probably giving up on like a very meaningful annual bonus. But at the same time, if you ever let them go, you're not suddenly, having to buy their stock back, right? So I like that format. I've either kept the baseline the same or grown the baseline by like a 5% per year growth. And then typically I'll give 10% to the leadership team, and either I'll split it up myself, or if there's a GM, I'll say, hey, 40% of this is yours, and you can choose how to do the rest.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. And my question, this was just a reflection of the previous question, is what do you think would be the minimum company size in terms of employees, or in terms of people involved? Sometimes they are 1099s that you would consider buying, because I see a lot of very small companies with like 3-4 people making a few $1 million a year, and I'm just like, I don't know what to do with that. Like, that's way too small. So my number in my head is 10, but I'm curious to see what your opinion is.
Yeah, I would say, so there are companies that have 3 employees but have a bunch of subcontractors that basically exclusively work for them, and so I would count that in the list of employees. Yeah, I would say minimum 10. My rule is that, first of all, the owner shouldn't be doing any technical work at all, ever. And that there should be a layer of management in place that don't do technical work. Now, that could be that the owner does no technical work and there's one manager and they manage 9 employees, and I'm still probably okay with that business. I would prefer that it's 3 managers and they manage 15 to 20 employees.
Sure. So now I'm looking at a company that has about 15 employees, and the owner, it's an HVAC company. So the owner told me that his main areas of responsibility is sales. I get that. And then also he goes to every job site every day, and he checks out the progress. Would you consider that technical work, or?
That's more project management. So when I say technical work, I mean like being like, say, a lead tech in the field, or being the only person who's able to do zoning or boilers in the company, right? Because then it's an immediate revenue loss the moment you buy the company. But project management, I would just consider that, and estimation, like these are roles that someone else will have to take over, you'll have to take over, or you'll have to hire for.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Just before we move on to Richard, someone in the chat is asking if you could repeat the comp structure.
Yeah, so for the leadership team, it's 10% of EBITDA above a baseline, and that baseline is either basically what the company made last year, or it's what the company made last year plus a small amount of growth, right? Like 5% growth or something like that, and that 5% extends each year. And then I'll split that across the entire leadership team. And then and that's usually 3 or 4 people. And if there's a GM, they'll get, let's say 40% of it. Sometimes you can leave some unallocated as well. It's important to note that I don't actually communicate this structure until probably 6 months or so after the leadership team is formed. I do say that you'll be compensated like owners with a bonus based on growth and based on how much money the company makes. But I want some time in the leadership role for kind of, sometimes the leadership team needs to adjust a little bit. Some people opt in and then opt out. And so it's usually about 6 months or 2 offsite workshops before we introduce it.
Thank you. And Richard, go ahead.
How are you handling non-solicitation when there wasn't one before, or non-competes? I mean, some states allow non-competes, some states don't. But how do you handle that with the key employees and maybe some of the key techs in the company? Because sometimes they'll say, "Well, we never had them sign anything."
Yeah.
Do you have them give it to them to have their employees? How is that? How should that be handled? Because some of them that was kind of a contention in one of my dealings.
Yep. Okay, so I would segment this. If the employee has equity, or if the employee is a family member of someone with equity in the business, I would require non-compete, non-solicit, non-disparagement. Just that's part of doing the deal. In all other cases, I typically would not require it unless we're giving something substantial to balance that out, and then I would put it all within a single sort of employee handbook. That usually happens, let's say, a few months into company ownership, so it wouldn't be a condition of the sale.
Okay,
So for example,
you let, I mean, it's kind of a risk, right? Because maybe
yeah,
they didn't have anything signed before, and then now you bought it, and then maybe a group of 5 guys just leave with a bunch of customers. Well, you didn't have any non-solicit in place. Now you're screwed because those 5 people left to go start their own company. I mean, and you didn't force it as a condition of the sale. Now, maybe 2 of your largest companies, these guys were just left, right? And nothing you can really do. I mean, these, and one of them was the master, So what do you? I mean, I guess you can say, I guess you don't make it as a condition, which is fair because sometimes they don't want to sign it, but a lot of these places they don't sign it, and that's where I kind of struggle. I was like, it's such a huge risk for me. And then to go back to the deal and say, hey, as a condition, if X percentage of the deal walks off, then you have to forgive my loan. And that's, they just want, they're already thinking they're doing you a favor by even, carrying 5%, right? 5 or 10%, especially in a competitive view. I guess
yeah,
it's just trying to craft this so you're not screwed if the guy just walks out,
Yeah, that's the right way to think about it, but you have to think about, like, who's the party that's giving something up, and it shouldn't be the employee, right? It should be the seller. So I would look at this.
I'm fine with them if they want to leave and go work for a competitor. You just can't take my customers with you, right? You're free to do whatever you want. It's a free country. If you don't like how things were, you want to go work for competitor A, you just can't go to competitor A and start calling my customers that I just bought, paid millions for, and then now, hey, by the way, come over here. I mean, there should be some penalty for that, right? And I try to explain that to the owner. Say, look, I don't care if they leave, but they just can't take what I just bought, all this goodwill and your customers. But it's kind of do I make them sign? Do I make the employees sign, or do I give it to the current owner, to then hand it to their people and sign?
Well, I look at this in first of all, I think the risk of giving this to an employee that doesn't have equity, probably isn't aware, even necessarily aware of the sale. The risk outweighs the potential benefit here, in the sense that you're kind of leading. It's all, trust is reciprocated here, right? And you're kind of leading with distrust. And so I think that risk outweighs the potential benefit. What I meant to say here is, like, if you really see a key man risk in the business, you should tell the seller. You should have some kind of forgivable note with the seller, or earn out equivalent around that, but not around specifically this employee who maybe isn't even aware of the sale right now, goes and solicits other employees or customers, right? I think that should fall on the seller.
Yeah, okay. So in my negotiation, I said, look, right when we get close to closing the deal, one condition of close is you have these 5 people sign I don't have the whole company sign it, but I was proposing, look, here are the 5 people that I want to have sign this non-solicitation. I mean, And I try to explain it's not you have to work here. You can't ever work forever. No, you just can't solicit my customers for I said 2 years, right? And I said, like, it was reasonable, 2 years. I'm the owner. I said, hey, look, maybe 5 to 10 years for the owner, but for the key people. And I was just kind of interested. What was kind of like the best practice? Because I mean, there's that risk there, and if there's a big customer that you're concerned about, that you don't want to leave. Maybe that customer's 30% of the revenue. I'm just trying to figure what's the best practice. Or I mean, you could just go and say, hey, we're just gonna trust that it's not gonna happen, and that you kind of really get, So I guess there's many ways to structure it. I guess you could put it as part of forgive and know. Hey, if this condition happens, then you forgive, this amount of the note. But then, what do you talk about, as far as the holdback and the note, right? Because you got a holdback component, and then you got the note component. So there's kind of like two things, and then, does he really want to tie up, 40% of the deal? Yeah, I mean, so I'm just trying to figure what's a good medium, what's a good balance to make sure you're kind of protected, but then he's still comfortable with having some sort of accountability or some sort of legal recourse, or if something happens.
Yeah, it comes down to, I think, individual preference and risk associated with the individual deal. If you want to send me a DM or something, and we can talk a little bit more specifically about the deal, I'm happy to address it. Again, my personal preference, and maybe I think I'm just a more trusting person in general than average, is I would like to lead with trust, and because I think that gets reciprocated. And if I lead with distrust, I'm worried that would get reciprocated. Yeah, so feel free to send me a message, and we can take this on a DM.
Go ahead, Dean.
How's it going? So I wanted to ask about, maybe you can give us an example about like growth, and like what are you seeing like on average, or usually, like once you guys do buy either a plumbing or an HVAC company, like are you guys seeing the 10 to 15% growth after the structure is put in place, or not so much? Like what's the average? What's the usual?
For an AE buying a business, or for us buying a business?
I guess both. I don't know. Either.
Okay. Yeah. So I'd say a first-time acquisition entrepreneur. I would structure it as probably a slight revenue decline year one, call it 10%. A slight gross profit margin growth. So overall, a gross profit, maybe very slight decline or about even. Your EBITDA margin will go down for sure year one, and probably year two. So that's year one, and that's where all the learning happens, right? That's where you're kind of getting the subject matter expertise, and that's where all the change happens. Year two, year three, it depends on how sort of management run you get. But the top businesses would have about a 40 to 50% year-over-year growth, and an average business might have, 10%. So probably somewhere in between those two numbers, depending on how well things are going, depending on what kind of business it is. But for the sake of being conservative, I would always model a revenue decline year one, and an OpEx increase year one, year two, year three, right? And then probably some conservative growth, let's say 10% per year.
Gotcha. But like on average, like you see with like what you guys are doing, you're seeing that a lot, like between 10 and 50%.
Yeah, and so once you're in like acquisition number two, and you kind of know what you're doing, it looks stronger than that. But if you're first time, I would say model a year of learning, right?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, so to context, I'm in a pre-LOI world, so I'm twitchy, haven't gone through the process. My question is about what you're saying about transparency. Who can I open up and say like, hey, I got 400K of war chest, but maybe I only want to put 300K down. I only believe the company's worth this, right? I know I wouldn't tell the seller, hey, I've got more money than, I'm offering. But what about my lender? Things like that. Who should I be open with and who should I be a little cagey?
Well, I think you can be open with your lender. If you have 400K and you want to put 200K, that's what you tell them. This is what I want to put down. They want to know that, if something happens, are you willing? Will you be able to access the other 200? Which you probably will. Now, if you really do feel you don't want that, and you kind of want to shield some of your equity, you can, and that's fine. That's your own choice. And a lot of people will also do that, with any properties they own. They'll kind of draw on them so they won't be collateralized. And that's not legal advice, but people do that.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
gonna say they're gonna spread you open. You're not gonna be able to hide.
You're right.
Unless
The
you
lender
commit
will know
perjury
all.
or something not good, right? Unless you're physically going to try to hide it, you're going to have to do the personal financial statement. You're going to have to tell them everything you got, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you have to give them everything you have, right? So any lender is not going to be like, yeah, you got to give us every dime you have. If it's, it's going to be whatever the deal requires, right? So like if your deal requires 10% or it requires 5%, or maybe, you should never really have to put in more than 10%. Otherwise your numbers are probably not very good, right? It's probably not a very good deal in general. So if you have to bring in more cash than 10%, that probably means your debt service coverage is suboptimal, would be my guess.
I got it. Right. This isn't, to be clear, this isn't to hide from the lender. I was just thinking like, yeah, I definitely don't want to tell the seller's broker I have more, that doesn't seem to help me in negotiation, but I want to be upfront with my broker, I think, and then clearly my lender. It's my prerogative of how much I want to put down, even regardless of how much they know about it. Is that the right mindset?
Absolutely. Anybody on your side for sure.
Cool. All right. Simple question. Thanks, Joe.
Go ahead, Justin.
Yeah, thank you. Hayden, this is kind of in the weeds, but we experienced it at our company when we were acquired last year, and definitely had played a role in employee satisfaction. When you acquire a company in an asset sale, what had come up in my experience is employees were very, very concerned around making sure the healthcare expenses that they spent in that year and applied to their deductible did not reset after the acquisition. And I'm wondering if you have ever experienced that, or if there's a way to like roll over their deductible so that they're not starting from scratch mid-year.
That's a good question, a very specific question. I've not experienced it. I will ask our people and culture person if they have and get back to you.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Casey.
Hayden, when you were talking about your diligence stuff, you were talking about asking about key people and the last time they took vacation, how long. I just wanted you to kind of explain like what you're getting at, like what do you want to know and learn from that question?
A couple things. So there's some key person risk stuff that I want to learn there. There have been some businesses where someone wore 6 hats and hadn't taken a vacation in 10 years and was really burnt out. And so I want to be aware of that risk. I also want to know kind of how the culture looks at that, right? Because does the culture celebrate that? Or does the culture, try hard not to have that happen? those are the main two things. It's kind of key person risk and culture. And any time where you find out that nobody takes vacations, that's probably worse. That's probably a worse company than the equivalent company you're trying to buy, where you found out everyone took a vacation, for 2 weeks last year, and the company still made the same amount of money, right?
Okay. Yeah, that helps a lot. Thanks.
And James, you had your hand up. Do you still have a question? Oh, you're still muted. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, how about now? Okay, sorry. So I don't know if this is the right place to ask it, but so since my deal's e-com, and I know you guys have a history of e-com, as far as prior to Acquira, right? Do you have experience with like 3PLs or are you primarily kind of like, were you guys kind of like Amazon heavy, or kind of your own warehouse? Like what did that look like? Because I'm kind of trying to evaluate, while in diligence, the potential to even close this warehouse, move it all to a 3PL, and
Yeah, we either did FBA or our own warehouse, and we didn't do that many e-commerce deals. Just
Okay.
a handful. I can put you in touch with someone though, if you remind me, who does a lot of this, and I'm sure he'd be willing to give you some advice too.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, I think that wraps up the questions, unless anyone has anything else.
Cool. I'll talk briefly about, gonna have 10 minutes or so here. I sort of the first on-site, and some of the things that we like to look at. So you probably have seen, articles and stuff out there about this concept of sort of downloading the seller's brain. So basically, one of the first things we'll do on the first on-site post-close, and this is, I'd say, like literally within 2 hours of getting there, is we'll interview the seller, previous owner at that point, and any high-level managers, in order to kind of understand the depth of the organization. And so typically what we'll do is we'll take, their payroll chart, and we'll add a bunch of columns around the actual work that people do, and we'll have them score their employees based on their ability to do those jobs, right? So if it's HVAC construction, what's their ability to do various parts of the rough-in or the setup, and that kind of gives us a quick ability to assess, at least where the managers believe everybody's at. It also allows us to see a lot of incongruencies. So you'll often find a person who, might get an 8 across the board and is making $3 an hour less than someone who's got a 4 across the board. And then you need to ask the question why. And it also shows you where depth is lacking in the organization, right? So you might see that you have a ton of experience on the rough inside, but really only 2 people are actually good at the set outside, right? Or only 1 person can do this one task. So that's a big thing. It also helps you prioritize your one-on-ones, right? So within the first week of owning the business, you need to have one-on-ones with every single employee. You could have sort of one-on group with teams if that's the group's preference. But ideally, you have a one-on-one with every single employee. You also need to go to job sites, really, really important. And you need to be kind of the first person in and the last person out, day in, day out, for like quite a while, because that's going to be initially how you kind of earn people's trust, is by showing them that you work just as hard as they do. Bring snacks to the office, acknowledge people, care about them personally, like all the basics. And one thing that people probably don't realize is, like, spend an equal amount of time with the office as you do with the front line. So sometimes people are more comfortable with one or the other, and so just because of that, they end up spending 80% of their time with the office and only 20% the front line, or vice versa. Another thing you'll find is that culture, they often have two different cultures. Especially, I mean, the office guys see each other every day. The frontline people, especially if it's service, they're just out and about. And so you kind of need to be aware of both cultures. Sometimes you'll have one that's really healthy and one that's quite unhealthy. And do not say that things won't change, because things will change. So I think a lot of people want to be able to say that to put people at ease. But yeah, don't do that. Ideally, what you want to get out of that sort of that skills matrix that you start in that first day on site is you want to turn it into kind of a training and upskill program. So you want to create levels based on where new skills are required, and sometimes that skill isn't necessarily like a hard skill. It could be just being bilingual, or being able to drive with a driver's license. And sometimes it is more sort of hard skill based on like your ability to weld or charge refrigerant, right? So each of those levels should kind of correspond with wage increases, so people are motivated to learn. And then you almost immediately want to implement, because supply is one of the biggest bottlenecks in these businesses. You almost immediately want to implement a employee referral program. And especially when that goes along with this sort of upskill program, you're basically motivating people to backfill for themselves, and kind of move up the ladder. And that referral program is usually, depending on how generous you want to be, it's probably 1 to 5K, and then it's usually paid in 2 payments. Again, depending on how generous you want to be, you could have one payment in 1 month or 3 months, and the next one in 3 months or 6 months, right? As long as the new employee is still working there. Any questions around kind of that first initial visit? Because that's a really crucial time. Things that you should do or should not do.
Is there a reason that you would not do that prior to close? Is there a reason that is directly after close? You wouldn't like kind of at least figure that out with the owner prior?
100% you can with the owner. Maybe not so much with managers,
Right.
but with the owner for sure.
Okay, so you're saying like with the managers, because they're going to probably know more than likely people's strengths and skills and stuff. Okay, that makes more sense.
Yeah. Ideally, you want to do it with the direct supervisor.
Right? Could you say more about the don't say that things won't change, because things will change? You maybe just offer some of the language or describe how you put that to people?
Yeah, so I would say, I just know that people want everyone else to feel comfortable, and so they'll want to say things to put other people at ease, but you really need to be honest and not give people a chance to call something out that you said it would be a certain way and it isn't. You'll be able to quite quickly within the one-on-ones read between the lines and understand what people really care about. So there's one business I was doing a one-on-one, and the guy he was a tech, had 5 kids, and I've kind of sort of sensed that a lot of people were worried about losing their benefits, because they had good benefits, this company. And I told them, hey, the benefits aren't changing. We're keeping them as they are. If anything, we'll try to be even more generous in the future, but we're definitely not taking anything away. And he just started crying because he was so freaked out that he has 5 kids, that we removed the benefits. He basically lost his job. So if you can sense that, then I'd say, yeah, you can make some of these statements as long as you're 100% sure you'll follow through on it. In terms of announcing the sale, you really want to acknowledge the great company that they've all built together, including the seller, and be grateful to have such great people. You want to acknowledge that they're the experts, not you, and that you'll do your best to continue the legacy. And usually the seller will be there, and the seller will probably get pretty emotional. But yeah, I wouldn't try to be something you're not, and I wouldn't tell people something you're not 100% certain of. And one thing I'm 100% certain of, things will change. So don't say things won't change. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that helps a lot. Thank you.
So I'll close off with some thoughts on like what people and culture is in the companies that we buy, because I think it's fairly unique to us that we actually have someone in this role. So basically, we have like a people and culture framework, just because that's a huge piece of this business, and it's slightly different than HR, right? Whereas HR might cover a lot of those things, like hiring and even some level of onboarding training. There's a level of I'd say like communications, handling communications within the company that typically an owner does that we put on a different role. And also things like ensuring that people's systems are followed. Again, because these things, it's a lot of work of holding people accountable. And I find that, a lot of entrepreneurs aren't good at it. So things like, okay, so communication, right? You have a leadership team, you have weekly leadership team meetings. Every supervisor should have one-on-ones with their direct reports. These things should happen. Performance reviews, though nobody likes them, they're super important to be held, right? So all of those things are part of the people and culture department's responsibilities. Job description. So we have something that's called a clarity board, which is sort of a one place for everything that includes job descriptions linked to processes and KPIs. Those are all developed by the people and culture person with the appropriate manager. So it's the people and culture person is responsible for making sure it gets done, but not necessarily responsible for doing it because they don't necessarily know the job fully. This person is typically young, female, and tech savvy, and is typically going to be your tech person at the company. And by tech person, I don't mean they're programming, but they're comfortable with computers and Google Sheets and Google Docs and Gmail or whatever system you want to use. Just because a lot of these companies, it's like pen and paper. Everybody in the office is it's like a Luddite, and that's one piece of change that nobody likes, right? Because it makes them feel dumb. In terms of who the person is, most of the time this is the role we hire from outside, simply because it doesn't come with any relationship baggage from within the company. Now, there have been a couple times where we just had the perfect role, and we just promoted from within, which is actually both those times have worked out really well as well. I would say that the motivation, the person needs to be comfortable with confrontation. They need to be really comfortable with telling you no, and basically to represent the employee against you sometimes. And they can't be someone that you can just run over, which means, I'd say they need to not care too much about being liked and care more about being trusted, if that makes sense. Typically, if you're part of ACE, we have a people and culture integrator that takes the people and culture person through the people and culture framework, which basically results in a clarity board for every single employee. And then you have all the processes, like we have like a big 5 processes of all people and culture. And if you're Acquira Plus, that's all included as well. Yeah, any questions on people and culture person, at least our approach to it?
Yeah, I guess I have a question because you were kind of touching on it. So a lot of these companies, I don't see that they have like actual HR, but I'm in the Northeast, and I know it's going to be very important to have somebody that's like, I don't know, 70% spend their time on recruiting,
Mhm.
or 50%, and like, because we have enough work here. There's so much work here. It's more trying to win over workers. So can I put that on a people and culture person, or do I need to kind of do another person and know that I need a recruiter as well if I want growth?
Oh, no, that will typically be the people and culture person. I would say recruiters are useful for very high level functions. You might be worth getting a recruiter if you need a senior estimator, as an example, or like a senior project manager. But if it's more like more junior jobs, yeah, I'd say I keep it on the people and culture person.
Okay.
And typically, the ability to do everything else they're doing and make, let's say 2 to 3 hires a month while doing good onboarding and training, I think that's doable. If you're looking at more growth than that, then yeah, you may want to.
Even in the Northeast, 2 to 3 like plumbers, you think you can find? It's tough.
Yeah. I mean, it's tough. It's work, but I mean, that's all you do. That's 70% what you do.
Yeah, that'd be incredible. I mean, here, if you can hire plumbers, you usually have work.
Yep.
Well, at least where I am. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we had one company, we hired people and culture person on their own, hired 30 people in 4 months. Yeah.
It's savage. Probably in Florida, something like that, or
Northwest Arkansas.
Okay.
Yeah.
Similar. But that's really amazing. That's incredible.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that was a bit of an exception to the rule. One other thing about the people and culture role, often if the company isn't growing at that clip, in about a year or so after that first sort of big move towards all of these systems, that role will often become a bit more of an office manager plus people and culture role. So just to be aware that it could go that route if you don't need that level of hiring. But it will be a full-time role at least for a year, just to build out the systems.
Go ahead, Janice.
Hey, Janice, you
Janice,
must
do you
be
have a
muted.
question?
Oh, left.
Oh.
Cool. We got to about half of the stuff I wanted to cover. Oh, Janice is back. Maybe she left by mistake.
I guess not. I don't know.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks everyone. Have a great weekend.
Can you hear me?
Don't look at the. Oh, hey, Janice.
Oh, hi, can you hear me? I'm sorry. Okay, I have been listening to everyone, and I think the business that we have is kind of different from what everyone has, which we do have a sandwich shop, kind of like, or a sandwich restaurant, kind of like a Subway, but not a Subway. It's Lenny's. So some of the things you talked about doesn't apply to us, but the people and culture, seeing that we hire like young kids, how do we incentivize them? One. And two, the people and culture, the turnover rate is so high that we're the one that actually does the hiring. How can you help us with that? It's kind of a whole different realm that we're in, different from what I'm hearing other people talk about. So any advice, Hayden?
It's not that different. I mean, if it's kind of similar to like say a landscaping company. It's very high turnover. You're gonna want to have really, really strong training and onboarding, and you're gonna want to have an employee referral program for sure.
Okay.
So a lot of those things are the same. Yeah, I don't think it changes that much in a sandwich shop.
Okay. What about the incentivization? How do you incentivize kids to want to stay? What would you suggest that we do? The the employee referral sounds really good. So I guess we could come up with something as to how to keep them in that sense. But
so what's the age of the employee? Average employee at
high
school age?
student. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's difficult because they have school. Usually people stay in those types of jobs because they like the people that they work with, which is why I think referral is so important. But yeah, if you're focusing on a younger group, churn is just a reality. Yeah.
Yeah.
So something something that I heard from somebody who owns multiple like grocery stores. So he's got like, they do, I don't know, 20 or 30 million dollars a year in like the Northeast. And so they also hire, younger people, right? So, they have a huge turnover. And he said the one thing that changed the entire game for them was being able to schedule an interview like at first contact, right? So getting, the first time they reach out to you, the first time, whatever, being able to immediately schedule an interview. And he said their hiring problems kind of disappeared, right? Especially for the high turnover, because it was the drop off, because these younger people especially are kind of like shotgunning, right? And it's almost like the first person to reply to them gets the employee essentially, right? So that's something I heard from him recently, and it might apply to you. So, making the application and the first interview, right, as immediate as you possibly can, or as automatic as you can schedule it, should reduce your number of applicants you have to interview to even get somebody, right, or number of applications you need to receive to even get an interview, right? Which was one of his bottlenecks, I guess, right?
Okay. Thank you so much. That was helpful. Appreciate it.
No problem.
All right. Have a great weekend, everyone. Don't
You
look
as
directly
well.
at the sun on Monday. It's going to be our first solar eclipse. I didn't realize that like Canada and Mexico and the US don't see them all at the same time. Because you guys got one like 5 years ago, something, right? Or 7 years ago?
I don't know. Ours is on Monday too, I hear. So I don't know. I hear some people are flying over to the West Coast to get a better view or something. I don't know. I'm not rich enough to do that yet, so
Yeah.
I'm just gonna watch it on YouTube probably or something.
Watch it on YouTube.
All right. I'll see you guys later.
All right. See you guys.
Thanks,
Thank you.